So my name's Lawrence Freeman, Gathered Vice Principal for Strategy and Development. This is a really timely discussion. At the G20 meeting, you had the old European imperial powers suddenly realizing they're running, well, not suddenly realizing, coming to terms with the fact that they're running out of money and going to the emerging economies and asking for help. And the emerging economies saying, not sure. And I think that captures part of the interest of this evening, is that we sense a moment of transformation, of new powers coming into being, new configurations of power in the world. And it's not wholly clear what this will mean, what the individual countries want out of this. And the title, Who Wants to Be the Next Superpower, is a little ambiguous on this, because there's two questions there. There's a question, if it's a competition, which one of us should it be? But there's also, do you really want to be a superpower? There's a lot of presumption at the moment that economic power leads inevitably to military power and some sort of drive to world domination. But is that a terribly sort of 19th century game of diplomacy sort of view of the world? What are the incentives for the emerging powers to play that sort of role? How do they have particular concepts of what it is to be a great power, never mind a superpower? Are they comfortable in those roles? Do they accept it comes with rights and yes, but responsibilities? Well, that's another question as well. So I think there's a very rich topic here, and I, for one, am very much looking forward to hearing the discussion. Now, what I'm going to do now is to introduce our participants, and as Keith has indicated, these are people to the fore of our new and very successful institutes. So we have Professor Sunil Khilnani, who's Director and Professor of Politics at the India Institute. Prior to this, he was the Starr Foundation Professor and Director of South Asian Studies, a program that he'd established in 2002 at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. Then Professor Anthony Pereira, Professor of Brazilian Studies, Director of the Brazil Institute. He has previously held a number of academic positions at Tulane University, University of East Anglia, amongst others, been a visiting professor at Harvard and the University of Boston, and Dr. Suzanne Yang, lecturer in Chinese Studies and International Relations at the China Institute, also a senior research fellow in international relations at the Center for International Strategic Studies at Beijing University, and prior to joining King's, she was Deputy Director of Leadership Programs for China at the University of Oxford. And we're particularly grateful, I think, for Mr. Andrew Jack to come today and act as our moderator. Andrew is journalist for Financial Times, as many of you will know, Papers Moscow correspondent, and then bureau chief from 1998 to 2004, and also served as Paris correspondent and financial correspondent. And he's author of a number of books, most recently a book that got a lot of attention, Inside Putin's Russia, 2005, still inside Putin's Russia today, and The French Exception, 2001, still a French exception today. So I'd like to invite the panellists to come up and we can get started. Thank you very much.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Thanks very much for coming, and thanks for the introductions. It's great to be here. Nice to see so many people. And judging by the ambitious goals that we've heard here about the creation of these international institutes and fundraising, perhaps I wonder if actually at least the player that wants to be the next global superpower is none other than King's College itself. But this evening, we're going to be talking about three large superpowers or potential superpowers for the future. And in a sense, we're debating this whole idea of the BRICS, that phrase coined actually by Goldman Sachs at the turn of the millennium around these regional powers that were emerging themselves very important demographically, hugely important economically, and increasingly, to some degree at least, decoupled from the much more slow rate of growth that we've seen in Europe and the US, the older industrialized nations in the past few years. So really emerging very forcefully on the global scene. But as you've already heard, of course, as a former Moscow correspondent, there's a tragic missing player in the BRICS represented this evening, because as a chairman, of course, I have to remain neutral. But I do personally believe that, well, I suppose technically you'd say the BRICS without the R of Russia, and all you get is bickering over the sort of the odds around the edges. And of course, as others have argued in the past, if you take the Sea of China out of the BRICS, all you get is brie, a sort of soft cheese that doesn't really have much structural potency. You might argue, of course, remove the B of Brazil, and particularly its huge agricultural productivity potential, I suppose you have a sort of form of rickets. And certainly not least, though final to be mentioned, but I suppose the BRICS without the eye of India is just simply incomprehensible, or at least unpronounceable. But nonetheless, we're here today to talk about those three, Brazil, Brazil, China, and India. In fact, in that order, the B, C, and then the I. And there was a sort of, when this program was initially announced, the title, as you see, was Who Wants to Be the Next Superpower? But also, as we've heard, we're also going to talk about really who will be the next superpower. And we'll talk perhaps during our discussion, we'll start with some short introductory remarks, about 5 minutes from each of our Institute speakers, and then we'll have a bit of a dialogue, and then very keen to open it up to you, as well as perhaps some questions that we've already polled online. And incidentally, for those who might be following this electronically, there is actually a Twitter feed, which is KCL Superpower, for any who want to put forward reactions, thoughts, or add to the debate this evening and going forwards. And incidentally, in the spirit of democracy, we have already done an online poll to get a sense of people's answer, not to that question, but who do you think will be the next superpower? We had, if I added up, including the last-minute submissions, 526 people replied to that. And I have to say it wasn't on the list, but in true, how shall I put it, autocratic style, some people have added in, subverted the question, added in Russia, so there were actually 3 votes for Russia, even though it wasn't being asked. There were 83 votes, which is 16% for India. There were 90 votes, or 17%, for Brazil in second place, and perhaps not surprisingly, in first place with 350, 67% judged that China will be the next superpower. But so perhaps let me begin not with China, but on the other side of the world with Brazil, and ask Anthony Pereira to talk to us first about why he thinks Brazil will be or wants to be the next superpower.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to Laurie Friedman for a very provocative question, VP Sir Keith Hoggart, my fellow panelists. I actually think a fairer way to decide this would have been to have football teams from each of the institutes play in a tournament, but we're here, so that wasn't accepted as a method. But I would like to start with a disavowal and then try to emphasize three issues that I think give Brazil a certain standing in the world that it didn't previously have. And the disavowal is that Brazil, I think, as the ambassador to the UK, Roberto Jaguaribe, reminds us, is a very iconoclastic country. I would add that it's a very irreverent country. And if one of its political leaders were to stand up and say, we are going to be the next superpower, I think the very next day somebody would write a samba song ridiculing this political leader, satirizing it. And in the very next carnival there'd be a float about this idea of a superpotencia, and it would be mocking it. And there's a very good reason for that, because Brazil, a conventional sense of superpower is often the military aspect. And Brazil is not a military power globally, and I don't think will become a military power globally. It does not possess nuclear weapons, unlike China and India. Unlike India, it has signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It is committed to remaining a non-nuclear power. It is, and this might be surprising to some of you, it's in a region, it exists in a region, South America, which is not known for a lot of interstate war. I'm not saying that it's not a violent region, but interstate wars have been relatively rare in South American history. And in fact, the last major war that Brazil was involved in finished in 1870. It did send 20,000 troops to World War II, but that was the last major war that it fought, ended in 1870. And so it's in a region that's very, very different from the regions that India and China inhabit, and it has total troop numbers of about 300,000 compared to over 1 million in these other countries. And so it's simply just a different order of magnitude when it comes to the military dimension. On the aspects that I think would make Brazil stand out as a potential major power in the world, I'd like to point to three. One is its overall economic situation. I'll try to be more specific about that. The second is its position as a regional leader, because I think that makes it stand out somewhat compared to India and China. And finally, its attempts to address its social deficit, because I think there's been a lot of progress in that area over the last 10, 15, 20 years. So the first point about the economy. There's a line in the Brazilian national anthem that talks about the country lying in a splendid cradle. This is a book that's called Beyond the Splendid Cradle. And you might dismiss this as a bit of 19th century romanticism, but Brazil's natural endowments, its natural resources, and its vast territory and relatively small population. I know it's odd to think of a country of almost 200 million people as small, but I'm here on a panel with people representing giants, demographic giants. And so Brazil has a lot of resources for a relatively small number of people, which means it will be able to realize a lot of the material ambitions of its population if it manages those resources well. For example, just in the last few years, the offshore oil deposits, the so-called pre-salt, have been estimated at roughly the size of the North Sea, the entire North Sea oil deposits. You have a country which my colleague Tony Allen calls, he says it in his book Virtual Water, it has a water endowment unmatched by any other BRICS or industrialized nation. So people talk about the coming scarcity of water and the possibility of conflict over water. Well, Brazil is a water superpower, both in terms of its so-called blue water, the Amazon, for example, but also green water, the water in its groundwater. It has a vast amount of land, cultivable land, that it hasn't brought into production. It's already feeding a good portion of the world through its agricultural exports. It has the potential to do a lot more of that. It has, and it's stumbled upon this, but it has an energy matrix which is surprisingly clean. And this is again, unlike India and China. It's self-sufficient in energy, unlike these countries, but it also has a very relatively clean matrix. So almost half of its energy comes from hydroelectric and bioethanol. Now, I'm not saying this was necessarily deliberate. The decisions that produced that energy matrix were made in the 70s, and they weren't made for green reasons. But Brazil is now poised to actually become a quite green country if it can continue along those lines. It's also, and this is this puts it in contradistinction to India, it has made the urban transition. It's gone from a 70% rural country in the 1960s to one that's 80% urban. And that, I think, gives it certain advantages in terms of continuing the economic development that it's been able to sustain over the last couple of decades. So I think it does lie in a splendid cradle in terms of economics. In terms of its regional leadership, and I'll try to hurry up here because I can make these last 2 points fairly briefly. In terms of regional leadership, it doesn't have a strong competitor in the region. Now, it's not to say that there isn't some resistance to its attempted hegemony in South America, but it's increasingly exercised leadership in South America through mediating conflicts, such as the coup attempt in Paraguay in the mid-1990s, the conflict between Ecuador and Peru, conflict between Venezuela and Colombia. When you see regional conflicts in South America, you usually see Brazil playing a constructive role. And this is a role that its diplomats see for themselves as being a mediating country par excellence, a negotiating country, a multilateral country par excellence. It's also started to invest in regional infrastructure. It's paying disproportionate costs for transportation, communication, infrastructure in the region, infrastructure that will facilitate regional integration. And I think China and India are both in regions where it's more difficult for them to play that sort of role. Finally, on the social deficit, Brazil does have an enormous social deficit. It was the largest slave-owning country in the world in the 19th century. Its economic inequality is legendary. But over the last few years, and again, unlike India and China, economic inequality has gone down over the last 10 years, even while it has been growing. Now, admittedly, it's been growing at a slower pace than India, China, but tens of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty in the last few years. By one account, by one measure of this, this is an FCO report, a majority of Brazilians have now entered the middle class, 52% of the population. This is a measure of middle class, which is not quite the same as you would find in Europe. It's a lower economic threshold, but that is still a significant accomplishment. And I think Brazil is poised to do more on that social deficit. It does have a consensus right now that inclusion, redistribution are elements of the new political deal, if you like, that I think is as significant as the New Deal in the United States was in the 1930s. These are policies that are including tens of millions of people who were previously outside of the consumer economy. And I think that gives Brazil some legitimacy internationally when what's on the table are issues such as the fairness of multilateral institutions, the nature of global governance, who gets to decide what about global issues of distribution, because I think inequality globally is still a very, very important issue, and extreme poverty is extremely important issue, and it's one that Brazil wants to engage with globally. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Suzanne, China.
If the Goldman Sachs report projections about the economic performance of the BRICS continues to surprise the world on the upside, meaning that by 2027, instead of 2050, that China will overtake the USA, and by 2032 and 34, Russia, Brazil, and India will overtake Japan, then indeed the world will really be very different from what it is now. The traditional definition of superpower, which was coined up in 1944 in the Cold War era, would that be still relevant to the world then? I'm supposed to focus on China. Few developments in international relations today are as complex, unprepared for, and so consequential to the world as the rise of China. Opposing views about China's rise, particularly concerning the very rapid growth in its economy and the very much of the very nature of that power of the growth over the last 3 decades, and also Chinese military modernization, including the most recent call for enhanced naval power projection capability, amongst other things, including energy and domestic issues, have all well been accounted for around the China discourse. I find very much underrepresented and very often misunderstood is the discourse, both inside China and outside, about a new Chinese identity, an increasing awareness about the level of Chinese cultural attractiveness to the world, which necessitates itself a sophisticated and nuanced analysis framework to measure and predict the meaning and impact of China's rise on the world. So the question is really, will China become the next superpower? We have just heard the poll, which I'm sure doesn't surprise anyone. And of course, earlier in July, the Pew Global Attitudes survey shows that in 15 Western nations, those who were polled said that 61 to 72% of those who were polled said that China would become the next superpower. I recall 61% in Germany, 65% in this country, Britain, and in Spain, that's 67%. And I think the highest in France, that's 72%. But the real question is, well, does China really want to become the next superpower? As China continues to develop, there's an ongoing lively debate within China about its future course. Chinese leaders believe that in the next 20 years will be a crucial window opportunity for China's development, in which they hope they think China must realize its national goals to become a comprehensive power capable of pursuing and defending national interests. Of course, consistent with this, domestic issues are paramount, i.e. Developing democracy with Chinese characteristics, relaxing tensions between the rich and the poor, handling central and local governments' relations. Then you have other issues on the agenda, like dealing with fiscal issues, establish welfare systems, so on, and so forth. Chinese top leaders announced, consistent with its domestic goals, that China will pursue a strategy for a version of development which might be unique or different. In President Hu Jintao's words, I quote, "China's development can only serve peace, stability, and common prosperity in the world." So that's to say it's peaceful development, which does not prioritize leadership in world affairs at all, let alone threaten any others in any way. So the view of peaceful development may not be shared by all inside and outside China. So what is the nature of China's rise? How can the world better understand and gauge the direction in which China is headed? China means enormous opportunities and challenges to the world. Opinions outside China about the discourse of peaceful development tend to circulate around two very divergent poles. A hardline international relations realist view holds that China just wants to take advantage of participating in global economy to continuously develop its power and its wealth, just to prepare for its domination of the world. And for liberal international realist theories, non-democratic emerging power constitutes a threat to stability. So they argue that unless China is brought into international society completely in a way that political and cultural homogeneity can be ensured, it is hard to envisage peace. Now, China, a benign presence, a superpower in the traditional sense in the coming decades. One can argue a China that deals with its domestic issues and continuously engages in constructive development, enhancing exchange with the outside world, developing politically, perhaps in a way consistent with its own cultural values, some of which could be universal, and improving governance locally and centrally. Such a China may become a cooperative counterpart to Washington in global affairs. One of the key issues for Chinese intellectuals and officials is to convey the message that indeed China's peaceful development model over the last 3 decades can be sustainable, and indeed it has benefits for global peace and prosperity. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Now for India, Sunil.
Thank you. Thanks to Keith Hoggart and to Laurie Friedman for their introduction. It's very nice to be involved in this sort of public engagement between our different institutes on such a resonant question. So I'm very happy to be part of this. There's something quite quaint about the term superpower today. I mean, it seems a term from a more settled age, a world where the meaning of power was clear and where the possessors of power were clear. And what I'd like to do is really to make 3 sets of points. First, about the changed character of global power, something that I think has happened quite fundamentally. Second, about India's resources in terms of the conventional markers of power. And the third set of remarks are really about why I think that the kind of power that is distinctive to India, which isn't the kind of power linked to conventional resources, the power of what I call legitimacy, will, I think, ultimately be most consequential in defining the nature of power in the future and therefore in consolidating India's role as a global power. So let me first start with what I think has changed in the meaning of power globally. And I think it is the case that the standard old Western definitions of power don't really hold. And that's, I think, one of the things that people find very unsettling. We are clearly seeing a decline of Western power. That's a sort of judgment that I think is commonly held from Paris to Westminster to Washington, that the dynamic of power has shifted eastwards towards Asia. But what I think that also results in is a kind of irreversible diffusion of power, not a reconcentration of power. So I think one of the characteristics of power in coming years is that it's going to be much more diffuse across the world. It's going to be much harder to reconcentrate it in one single center. And I think actually that is a position that India is very comfortable with. India has always advocated, right from its independence, even earlier in the early 20th century, it's always advocated for a greater diffusion of power across the world, for a multipolar world, if you like, to use the terminology of IR. But it's been much more comfortable with the idea that power is distributed across states in the world rather than concentrated in 1 or 2 or 5 central powers. And I think this unsettles Western notions of order and hierarchy. There's something troubling to those notions about that. But actually, this is something that India is comfortable with. The way in which the future of power is going is actually something that is very temperamentally comfortable for India. The second way in which I think global power is changing is something that's often noted, is the growing interdependence, both of markets and of states. And this is a complicated kind of relationship that gets set up. It's actually makes it much harder to determine who really holds power. The old billiard ball model of power, where the bigger ball knocks the smaller ones aside, no longer works. It no longer actually describes the way power works. And if, just to take one example, if you take the relationship between the 2 great powers of the world today, the US and China, actually, who holds the power in that relationship? It's really not clear. Is it the case that America is, as it were, paying China? Is it the case that China is essentially America's head servant, right? The manufacturing workshop of America supplying it cheap goods. Or is it the case that America is actually paying its future executioner? We don't know. We can't actually read that relationship. And that's the kind of way, that's the way in which power today is intertwined and very hard to determine who actually holds the power in a relationship. The third point about global power and its change, and I think, and this is to suggest that it underlines the fact that this interconnected power is not necessarily a benign or a gentle interconnection. The third way in which I think the nature of power is changing globally is that actually we're seeing a proliferation across the world of a plurality of worldviews and values. We are not converging on a set of universal values. We're not converging on a set of universally recognized norms. We're actually seeing a proliferation of more and more such claims, more and more claims to self-esteem, to civilizational honor, to self-respect, and so on. And that actually can often, it's liable to override a rational calculus of power. It can create a very dangerous world. And so I think that's a third aspect of the changing nature of power. And I'll come back to why I think India might play an interesting role in perhaps not reconciling those conflicting worldviews, but actually serving to bridge them in some ways. Because India itself contains so many diverse worldviews that it's had to connect and bridge in many ways. Now, let me make my second set of remarks, which are really about why I think India does actually have some important resources of conventional power, and why I think one shouldn't be too dismissive of them at all, in fact. First of all, is the 1.2 billion people of India and their demographic profile. That's a very important aspect to focus on. India is a young society. It's the youngest major society in the world. There is still what economists call the youth bulge, which still has to feed into the labor market. It's still on the upward curve of its demographic profile. China is no longer so. China is now already an aging society. There is a worry in China that it may become old before it becomes rich. India is still on the upward curve. So that's a very, very important fact. Of course, there are challenges about how one puts that to productive use, and we can come to that in the discussion. But India is a young society, and that's crucial for its future growth. Secondly, India now has achieved good rates of savings. It's around in the mid-30s. It's achieved what economists call the virtuous circle. It's a young society saving more and investing more. It has relatively well-regulated financial institutions. They're relatively insulated from global turbulence, etc. Third aspect of India's economic resources is the diversity and scale of the economy. India it's a vast economy, and it's a very diverse economy. India has right from heavy steel plant to high tech. This is something that's been built up over 60 years, and also regionally it's very diverse. And indeed, the scale of the Indian economy is one of the things that is its great comparative advantage today in the world. It's a vast market, but it also gives it a certain stability and resilience. The third is its efficiency in the use of capital. India, until recently, has had about 1/10 of the foreign direct investment of China. Yet its growth rates have been only 2 or 3 percentage points less than China, which suggests that it's a more effective use of capital. It actually is using it more productively. It hasn't invested in vast, pharaonic, baggy infrastructure projects. It's tended to be more kind of focused in the way it uses its capital. Fourthly, it's primarily a domestic-focused economy. India is not an export-led economy. It's domestic consumption, and that's actually crucial if you think about future economic growth in coming decades. The kind of Chinese model of manufacturing export and the kind of structural imbalances that's created globally are simply not sustainable anymore. It's certainly the case that Western electorates are not going to kind of allow that to happen. So that's another aspect. Finally, the very historical backwardness of India so far, in a sense, gives it much more space to grow. It gives it much more, it can actually play the catch-up game, I think, much faster. And there, the fact that, one of its most developed sectors is IT, information technology, actually gives it links to the latest technology, which can play a very important role in that catch-up process. How will this economic power be used? Well, some of it will be invested in military material. India is today one of the largest importer of military goods. It's going to be spending about $100 billion in the next years on military hardware. It has genuine maritime and space ambitions, but it's not going to ever become a military superpower in the conventional sense. It's not. Its defense spending is much less than China's, less than in terms of GDP. India's is about 2%, China's is about 7%. And one reason why it's not going to become a country that invests massively in its military, barring some major military crises or wars that it may find itself in, but barring that, that not happening, one reason why it's not going to become a major investor of large amounts of GDP in its military is because it's a democracy, because its people wanted to actually spend the money differently. And this brings me to my last set of remarks, which is really about this question of what is unique or distinctive to India. And I think the future power, the way in which power will function in coming decades, will be more and more dependent on and rooted in legitimacy. That's a resource which is much harder to accumulate. It's not, you can't technically produce legitimacy. It's not something you can manufacture. You can't get it out of the barrel of a gun. It's much more intangible, and therefore it's much more dependent on the vagaries of human belief. Like trust, legitimacy takes years to build up, and in today's world it can be destroyed in an instant. In the world of global opinion, of WikiLeaks, of viral video on YouTube, etc., reputation and trust can be lost very quickly. And I think actually national credibility, whether it's concerning markets, whether it's the use of force, whether it's human rights and democracy, these are absolutely vital resources. These are resources which you can't count in the same way. But these are resources that I think India has a distinct edge in over other new powers, other new emerging powers. It's India's power surge at the moment and in years to come isn't based solely or even mainly on economic growth or military ambition, nor indeed on superb sporting prowess or good dance rhythms, although it does have a bit of both of those, I have to say. But rather, it's going to be based on its persistence as an open society, a persistence against the odds as an open society, committed to constitutionalism, to democratic norms. And in that sense, India, I think, is the most striking instance of a non-Western civilization's commitment to Enlightenment principles, to, if you like, a critical modernism. And where you have this increasing dispersal of power, where you have powers increasingly interdependent nature, and where real power, I think, will lie with those countries or states that can bridge divides, the divides of interest, divides of identities, that can make workable coalitions. And India actually has a great deal of domestic experience in doing that. That's what its domestic politics is about. And that, I think, no state has managed democracy on a scale like India. The managing of that diversity of interests and identities. And I think that could be one of the greatest transferable skills that India uniquely possesses, which it can transfer to the international realm, a realm that is increasingly divided and conflict-torn. And so I think the ultimate power of India will lie in the power of its example. It's in particular in relation to what it's been able to do domestically, but how it can project that abroad. And I think, in that sense, India's eyes are not on some illusory prize of being recognized as a superpower that's defined by other former powers. Because I think true power is really not in the ability to physically coerce or even to seduce with the latest fashionable trinkets and baubles. It lies rather in the ability to redefine meanings, to persuade people to see the world differently. And that was something that 100-odd years ago, less than 100 years ago, Mahatma Gandhi once did for another age. And I think India may well have the capacity to do that again in coming years, to redefine the nature of power and show how actually other forms of power are going to be the most valuable resource in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, you're all quite timid in terms of the scope for your own preferred regions to be superpowers. But let's look at it in another way. Let's think about a few of the big drivers of superpower as we might do today. Let's start with the economy, and maybe I'll turn first to Tony, because Brazil, like a lot of Latin America, seems to have been that eternal country and region that's always on the cusp and never quite delivers, doesn't it? It's almost sleepwalked into success in the last few years. And meanwhile, the Chinese, amongst others, are very actively buying up and investing in raw materials, natural resources in Latin America. So, I mean, do you really think Brazil can deliver this time, or is it going to be overtaken?
You have touched a nerve. There is a bit of skepticism about this latest surge of development on the part of Brazil. Some people say, well, we've seen this before. We had the Brazilian miracle in the late 60s and the early 70s. Look what happened to that. It was massive over-borrowing and a lost decade in the 1980s. They're going to go through the same cycle of boom and bust. But I think if you look at the foundations, the economic and political foundations of this particular period of development, which started in about 1995, it looks a lot more sustainable. A lot of the pitfalls that they seem to have gone through in the 70s and 80s, that they seem to be avoiding this time. So it looks somewhat better founded. But you have touched a nerve, and I think that skepticism will remain in the background for some time.
And Suzanne, I mean, if you look at China, there's no question, obviously, of that enormous economic growth that's taking place at the moment. But how sustainable is it when you look at particularly the concerns about the size of debt, about the issues of rising costs, for example? How much can it continue on that current trajectory, do you think?
Let me start with an observation about the polls we have had this evening and also the Pew polls. Both overwhelmingly showed that China, in many ways, economic and military, maybe in other, financial terms, that China will become the next superpower, or is already a superpower. I remember Sir Lawrence writing back in 2004 about what is a superpower and what is a global power, and his definition is a power with global reach, meaning greater powers come with greater responsibilities, and these powers, they have greater influence over not just how international society works, but also the peace and the development of the whole world. And you can say that in China. China now is, by and large, playing that role. And that's one of the reasons I haven't quoted all these figures, these numbers about how strong China is. Of course, looking inwardly, China developing so rapidly, and there are many factual data which support many of the concerns in this room, and I believe outside, about how sustainable that economy can be. Really, this is not a question which we can give a very simple answer. It depends on many variables. What I can say is, if you look at what the Chinese governments have been doing over the last 3 or 4 years, i.e. mainly to readjust the development model economic structure, this will take time, of course. Now, if you talk about the very large foreign currency reserves, and talk about huge economic power there, inside China, the sustainability issue is very much debated, but I think the general feeling, what I can say, is still moving in the positive direction, and they are dealing with all these issues. What I can say is, whilst China is making efforts to develop its governance along the lines of more transparency and more participation in decision-making, which, of course, eventually will help to facilitate market economy. And it also has its relative advantages of being able to deal with problems in a very quick and efficient manner. What I'm saying here is not to support any authoritarian rule. What I'm saying is that it's just a simple fact that China might have created, at least over the last 30 years, a model of development which is very suitable for that cultural historical context. Thank you.
And Sunil, thinking about India, what do you think really are the limitations to growth? Traditionally, big protectionism, as you say, that's been largely liberalised in the last few years. But on the other hand, there are many other structural constraints on Indian growth, including the resistance of the Indian state, as you say, not investing perhaps in pharaonic projects, but very often not investing in projects at all. One gets the impression, in education, in health, and so on. And in the process, perhaps, its population, its human capital is being left behind compared to, for example, the Chinese. Will that be a brake on growth?
Yeah, no. Well, I mean, just to start with your first point, I think one of the interesting things is that India has gone from being a critic of globalization to being one of its great advocates because it's seen the benefits of it. And I think that's another example of what gives India's voice a particularly interesting edge, because this is a country that's seen both sides of the picture, so it gives it a kind of additional legitimacy in its advocacy. But coming back to the specific constraints, yes, I mean, there are a number. One clearly is the skills to create a labor force that can actually participate and drive growth. And so, the flip side of India's youthful demographic profile is that, they have to be trained and for the kind of jobs that India has to build. And it is the case also that India's growth at the moment is of a kind which is not creating the sufficient number of jobs that India's economy, that India needs. So that's a real constraint. There are, of course, also constraints of resources. I mean, India is not it doesn't exist in a splendid cradle like Brazil. It's a much more adult cradle and in a very difficult regional neighborhood, but it has very serious resource constraints. It's an importer of energy, and that's a real challenge. And that's one of the reasons why, precisely for India's own domestic development, it is going to have to engage very much in the world. And again, the globalization aspect comes in. A third, a more directly political challenge for India sustaining its growth will be the disparities that exist in India. I mean, there are parts of the country which are doing very well. There are other parts which are doing one third as well as those parts. And those create very large internal disparities and very difficult tensions to manage politically. And in a situation where the state is increasingly renouncing the tools it has to deal with those disparities, where it's leaving it to the market, that's going to be a real challenge for India to deal with. On the specific question of the Indian state and the kind of investments it's making, well, I mean, two things. I mean, one, the Indian state actually now has quite a lot of revenues at its disposal. The Indian state is not poor anymore. It's a question of finding effective ways to use it. And one area is, of course, infrastructure, which has been a very tangled and snagged domain, whether it's power, the generation of power, or ports, and these kind of things, where India has a lot of work to do. The other is education, higher education, but also lower down the rung. And there again, there's a lot of energy being put into it, but there's still a lot to be worked out. So there are real constraints. Well, there are real challenges, but there's a lot of discussion, I think, in India and attempts to. So actually, there's a lot of policy innovation going on in India today as well. So there is experimentation both at the regional state level and the national level to try and address some of these questions.
So let's talk about, unfortunately, a trend that perhaps is common across all three of your countries, corruption, something that really does, of course, we have to say, many countries closer to home also have their own problems, starting just down the road here, let alone across the continent. But nonetheless, the extent of corruption is something one sees and feels a lot in all three of your countries. Do you think that limits both their ability to develop domestically and their ability to project something to be proud of as a system to others?
Andrew, I'm shocked you'd bring up corruption. If you ask a lot of Brazilians what the main problem is, the main problem in the country is, a lot of them would say corruption. They might say quality of public health, they might say education, they might say violence, but a lot of them would say corruption. And I think it's a difficult topic to really approach, partly because the number of scandals that occur, and a lot of scandals have been occurring recently. I think 6 ministers have left office in this current government in Brazil because of allegations of corruption. And there might be another one on the way, I think now, as I speak, preparing his resignation. That doesn't necessarily mean that corruption has gone up. I mean, accurate measures, all the measures we have, Transparency International, for example, has a corruption perception index. It is a measure of the perception of corruption. It is not a measure of corruption per se. It's one of those topics that by its very nature is difficult to measure. And so the fact that we have these scandals may indicate that there is in fact rising indignation about corruption and an increasing intolerance of corruption, rather than simply that there's more of it about. And one of the striking things about Brazil these days, too, is that the investigations, we have now a federal police force that is better at investigating corruption. We have a public ministry, a sort of fourth branch of the government, which has been very active. You've had a little bit of sort of incipient citizens movement, and all of these movements and institutions have pushed on the corruption front, and yet punishment, effective prosecution and punishment of white-collar crime, political crime, campaign finance illegalities is very, very difficult. However, there's some evidence that politicians, and this is again a strength of democracy, this is really Sunil's point about India applied to Brazil, democracy allows voters not to vote for politicians accused of corruption. And there is some evidence. Sonia Gonçalves in the management department at King's has a very interesting research project where she shows that politicians accused of corruption have a lower success rate in trying to gain re-election than politicians who are not tainted in this way. So that gives you some indication that perhaps the electoral system works, even though the courts find it very difficult to convict. So it is a problem, I think, but it's a problem that there are some signs for being hopeful that it's something that can be overcome.
Suzanne, China has sometimes a pretty repressive approach to dealing with corruption, but it tends to be quite symbolic, doesn't it? It's still endemic.
Yeah, I mean, corruption is a very complicated social phenomenon in Chinese context. Partly it's perception, but also I think it's to do with a social institution. It's also to do with a grey area in the legal system. I recall one of my colleagues in Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, who is now a director of an institute. In 2003, she published an article. By the way, she's a European study expert trained in the US, and she's an expert about Germany. She studied extensively about the so-called social relations in European context, and then traced I should say, linking that or comparing that with the Chinese context. And I think she's got 3 points, sort of main arguments. In a way, not to downplay the sort of extent of the disease or cancer as a corruption to society, but to say that in Chinese context, where it is a deeply relational society, meaning that the people related to each other through a network of guanxi, and the people also very much like to show respect or gratefulness, great gratitude through giving gifts, and then this sort of conduct in China is very easily interpreted as corruption here. And when there is not a very sort of clearly defined or very rigid sort of legal framework where these areas are absolutely crystal clearly, demarcated or defined, then of course sometimes maybe anti-corruption can be used as a political tool to just get rid of your rivals. But other times, of course, it's really ongoing there. So there's a lot of truths. If you hear people say that corruption in China is this and that, there's a lot of truths there to be said. But then I think how you really contextualize individual issues, that's more relevant.
Sunil?
Yeah, well, corruption is it's big news in India who do it well. And corruption, it's a form of dependency. It is a dependency, and in societies that are deeply unequal, where there are serious inequalities, those dependencies will exist and they will be traded in different ways. And you know, it's a very deep set thing. It's a emanation, if you like, of a more fundamental inequality in the social structures. So, of course, you address corruption, but you also have to address other features of the society if you're really going to get at it. I mean, the Indian experience at the moment is somewhat similar to the way Anthony describes Brazil's situation. That's to say, there's been a lot of media attention on corruption. You do just yesterday or earlier last week. You had Indian ministers who were in the courtroom being with corruption charges brought against them in one of the largest corruption cases in India. There's also been, I think, a very important development which is given people a tool against corruption, given citizens and activist groups a tool against corruption, which is called the Right to Information Act, which is like FOIA in the US, the Freedom of Information Act, which has become, which was legislated in the previous UPA first-term government. And this is a very powerful piece of legislation whereby any public authority has to make available records, notations, expenditures, etc., to any citizen who applies, and it's a nominal fee. It costs you 10 rupees, hardly anything at all. And this has become a very, very important tool in bringing accountability to government. And one, particularly in certain states, it was pioneered in the state of Rajasthan, where there's a very strong movement on this. But one of the indices which shows how powerful this tool has become and how it's shaking people in authority is that a number of what are called RTI activists in India, right to information activists in India, have been killed in recent months. And this year alone, I think 20 or more have been killed because they are asking for information which is blowing the cover on corruption details. So this is a powerful resource which Indian democracy has. And it's being used more and more. There are training camps held across the country telling, as it were, non-literate people how to use this instrument. And where it shows like a school has been built, and actually there's an empty field where goats are sleeping. So you get the expenditure, you look at it, and you say, this is not what's happened. So there is a way in which it is being addressed, but it's a big problem.
And let's talk about the broader issue that comes partly out of corruption. At least two of your countries have got certainly a very vigorous and pretty independent press, but unfortunately it doesn't necessarily always translate into a reduction in corruption, the ability to hold people account, albeit what you said, Tony, to some degree with Brazilian politicians. It hasn't seemed to have changed or reduced the levels of corruption overall. And what all three of your countries also have in common is huge social inequality. In fact, I was going to quote from one of the questions that we had coming online here from a Chinese person who said, recently there was the incident, Suzanne, in China of a 2-year-old girl who was hit by a car on the street. No one offered help, and the girl was left to die. This is a bizarre and striking phenomenon, and people start to question China and a political system that doesn't respect human rights and the loss of morality. Now, that's China-specific, but it applies in some ways, in different ways, a sort of indifference to some degree, actually, between the richer and the poorer in all of your societies, and a reluctance or an inability to sort of mediate and unite. Is that a break, do you think, on future power and influence and development?
I think this incident, which unfortunately is very tragic, and then 2 years old got run over and nobody actually extended a hand to help, but it's deeply tragic. Reading this issue, you say the general public's response to this show, to me at least, three things. A is many people have very clear sense of rights now. They're talking about human rights should be respected, and they even suggest how such issues should be addressed in future terms. The other point is about why some people looked so indifferent. This is to do with two sub-points. A is scholars, some scholars based in Hong Kong and outside mainland China, they bring into this argument about the traditional Confucianist idea about you attach greater affinity to your family than you do to your clan, and than you do to the larger group. And if somebody was, sort of evolved not as a sort of direct relative, then some of them might feel uncomfortable. I'm not saying that I'm buying this argument, but there is one of the observations going. Of course, thirdly, this issue shows to some extent the loss of trust among people. Some people think if they got involved, they might be accused of actually having incurred such an accident or incident. So it's both, when you talk about the awareness of rights in society, it's a positive signal. But also if you think about the loss of trust among people, which it's really a sad thing. So it's a mixed message to me.
Sunil?
This is sort of social inequality.
Social inequality and how that's going to provide a break to the Indian model of progress.
Well, I mean, I think the question of disparities, not just regional but indeed social and gender disparities and so on, is more and more something that is pressing both in Indian politics but also Indian policymakers. And there, India has been very interested in the experience of Brazil and the way in which it's addressed questions of social inequality. It's also been interested in what China has been doing. And there's been a series of really quite interesting initiatives in social policy in India. So you had one of the largest guaranteed employment schemes ever that was legislated into law a few years ago. It's called the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which gives 100 days guaranteed labor to anyone in the countryside of a year. So it's like they get paid for that, and that actually has had an impact. It's established certain minimum norms of pay and so forth. There's a food security bill which is coming through. There's a whole series of social policy bills, and one can debate how prudent they are or not. I mean, they are saddling the Indian state with certain fiscal responsibilities and so on, which are going to have to be dealt with. But there is an attempt to try and address some of these with a seriousness that hasn't necessarily been always there. So I think that this is, at the same time, I mean, India has a ridiculous number of billionaires, and they're no longer embarrassed as they would have been some years ago by their wealth. They flaunt it, and people, and so far there hasn't been any kind of populist backlash against them. So they're still seen as potential characters to aspire to. But social inequality, particularly in societies that are growing fast, social inequality is very much a kind of concomitant of that, and that is happening. There's an attempt to address it. The challenge politically is going to be, can it be addressed fast enough to not explode? Of course, as we also know, there are parts of India which are where people have taken to kind of violent dissent against being deprived of their rights and ways of earning living. So it is a big issue.
Tony, Brazil.
I think Sunil was right to talk earlier about the nature of power, because I think this connects to the nation, the development of power in each of these societies. I mean, I think in the Brazilian case, what you have is an early period of its history where it was a colony, and it was a scattered settlements in a very vast territory in which the Portuguese crown, delegated power to very powerful individuals, capitães or captains in provinces. And you had a sort of fusion of personal and public power in a way. There was very little trust in the state as an abstract entity, and scattered populations tended to trust in their, sounds a bit like China, their immediate family, their kinship network, and perhaps their patron, their local landlord, and they didn't have much trust in the public sphere or the state as a universal institution. And as Brazil has developed, I think that early understanding of power has marked its political development. And so you have a relatively low level of trust in public institutions. People tend to trust their immediate extended family and their parentela or their connections. And this has made addressing questions of inequality quite difficult. That being said, I think there is a hunger in Brazilian society for a fairer type of society, a more solidaristic society, and you see that in some of these public policies, these new social policies. So Sunil referred to the conditional cash transfer program called Bolsa Familia, or family allowance. Now, this isn't a panacea. It doesn't give people jobs. It doesn't train or educate. Well, it insists that the parents receiving this money keep their children in school, so it does contribute to education of the next generation. But the actual adult recipients of the conditional cash transfer merely get a subsidy to their income. But this is something that has bridged the divide, the class divide, to some extent. There's also been a huge increase in formal sector employment in Brazil. It was marked for many years by a rigid dichotomy between the informal labor force and the formal, and that divide is dissolving to some extent. And we've also had regional growth rates in the poorer regions, such as the North and the Northeast, that exceed the growth rate, the economic growth rate in the richer parts of the country. And that's finally bringing some balance to the regional inequality. So I think there are historic barriers and there are historic constraints, but they're not over-determining outcomes. There does seem to be public pressure, the growth of a civil society, a yearning for a more solidaristic society with fair institutions that has to some extent nibbled away at that huge social gulf, which is still there. And it's also related to the question of violence in Brazil. I mean, where you have high rates of violence in favelas and so on, you have extensive social deprivation, and they're connected.
Okay. I'm going to open it up in a second to questions, so do put your hand up. But just a final round briefly, one area of the superpower issue that we haven't touched on so much, but the military one, the potential for conflict. Sunil, India, nuclear power on its border, some pretty lively and unstable neighbours. Is that a recipe for disaster in the next few years that could undermine India's development?
Well, I don't know if it's a recipe for disaster. Certainly, it certainly could. It's a very threatening environment. I mean, India's growth story and growth ambitions are located in a part of the world that is probably more dangerous and more conflict-ridden and more susceptible. I mean, more exposed to the entire range of possible types of conflict, from kind of the most primitive to nuclear warfare. I mean, there's no part of the world that encompasses that huge range, which means that actually India, as a military power, has to be prepared to be able to act at every level, from dealing with nuclear threat to dealing with people who come in on rubber boats, across the sea with guns. So it's an extremely threatening environment. I think India is it's an extremely unstable environment. And I think this again is this point about having to reassess the nature of what force and military doctrines really are, because it's not clear that having conventional military capacity actually protects India or secures India from some of the kinds of threats it faces. So it's having to also deal with these questions politically. What the whole uncertainty over what happens in Afghanistan once NATO and the Americans leave, what that effect has on Pakistan. Those questions are there. The uncertainty which I think the whole world feels about what China's ambitions are. I think that China's ambitions are not even necessarily transparent to its own leaders. What exactly it's going to be doing with the power that it's accumulating. So there's that uncertainty too. So it's a very risk-filled area. I mean, I don't think that it's about to top over into something in the next few years, but you can't predict these things to the nth degree, really. But it's a very unstable neighborhood.
Suzanne, does China know its military ambitions internally? And is there a potential, not just, for example, from Taiwan, but also with that very aggressive foreign investment into Africa, into Latin America and elsewhere, to create the seeds of discontent that could lead to conflict?
There's quite a lot of literature, particularly international relations, about the Chinese military modernization. And obviously, particularly in the USA, China's military expansion, they use this word, has to some extent stirs up some sort of fear, in the Pacific. But also, of course, if you look at Asia, Southeast Asian and East Asian region, of course, some neighbors do have this China threat thesis, which has been going on for quite some while, a decade or more than that. Now, if you look at the Chinese military modernization, which actually really took off after 1990s, because although it was set in late 1970s as one of the 4 modernizations, China didn't have any economic capacity to back that up. Now, transparency or Chinese sort of motivation of developing the military, these issues are very much debated. In a very recent article published, I think it's International Security, by Robert Ross, it's on Chinese so-called naval nationalism. In this article, very interesting, he examined the sort of Chinese planned or non-successful budget invested into developing conventional weapons and other more advanced technologies in the military sector. In his words, in effect, that's what he says, it's by no means will be comparable to that of the USA. So the so-called sort of alarm or the threat to US military on the global scale is desperately exaggerated, actually. There's no truth to the fact in that. Now, come back to China's side. Why does China develop military power, particularly since 2000, the last few years of the 21st century, particularly after 2008? For them, of course, the argument is it's just one of the 4 modernizations. It's part of the national goals. You need to balance all these 4 aspects of development in order to achieve the national goal of becoming a comprehensive power. B, the military sector Chinese government has decided to invest in or to expand its budget in are still very much for defense. It's absolutely for defensive purpose, according to them. Because if you say the most recent sort of call for enhanced naval power projection capability, it's not much that China is investing to build a new carrier, fighter carrier, in order to challenge the U.S. supremacy to guard this sort of sea lanes. China has no capacity to do that at all. Now, what they are talking about is, okay, Chinese citizens, protect the citizens in cases like the pirate, like in Somali. In South China Sea, that area, of course, you have this island, Spratly, and the parcels, territory issues there. But to what extent these are major concerns of Chinese government? That's an issue to be discussed. It's deterrence to the most, according to many of the mainstream analysts in China. Now, talking about transparency in military budget, Chinese started to publish this white paper, defense white paper, and they have incorporated lots of sort of mechanisms and also incorporated take on the criticism by the West to do what they can. And of course, they also have their argument that even the US doesn't completely give full transparency to their military strategy or their budget. Now, if I come back quickly about, you're talking about this, this Robert Ross was talking about the sort of nationalism behind the effort put into expanding military. To him, it's more sort of perception, actually. So many Chinese people, particularly the military sector, they think that it's time for the very backward military sector to catch up a little bit. And the first shock, of course, within Chinese military sector about how backward its conventional weaponry and its other more so-called advanced weapons. How backward that in comparison with the USA? It came in the first Iraq War in 1991. So they kind of said there would be no possibility for China to really become a power even regionally with such a backward sort of weaponry inside.
Tony, is Brazil too passive for its own good?
Well, I had a friend whose father served in the Home Guard in World War II, and they used to take the military slogan, which was matar or morir, which was kill or be killed, and they turned it into a joke about whether they would run to the mata or the moru, run to the forest or the hills, if the Germans actually came. So it's got a somewhat different military tradition than some countries. That being said, the military was in power, actually. There were a series of generals who ran Brazil from 1964 to 1985. And so when the debate turns to the military in Brazil, there's a big concern about what role can the military play under democracy that will that'll keep it from interfering, keep it out of politics. And I think they've been successful largely. But the perceived enemies are not so much state actors, they're non-state actors. So where is the Brazilian military serving outside of Brazil at the moment? Well, it's in MINUSTA, it's the UN peacekeeping force in Haiti. It is also being deployed along the borders. Brazil has a massive land border with 10 different countries, 3 of whom are major producers of coca and cocaine, some of which comes through Brazil. And this is a very hard border to defend, but the military is called in occasionally to try to secure the border. It's also sometimes called into favelas in Rio de Janeiro. So I think, that being said, there is, in the last white paper, the 2008 military white paper, my colleague Juliana Bertasso has written about this, there is a call in that white paper for a military-industrial complex. And you might think, why would the Brazilians want a military-industrial complex? But they see it as a potential driver for innovation, for the kind of research and development they want, and the innovation. And they want greater links between their universities and their industry and the Department of Defense. And I don't know how successful it would be in kickstarting it, but the military is a institution which sees itself as a kind of national integrator. Their war plans are to defend Brazilian territory in the Amazon. They're preparing for, or at least sort of worst case scenario, they're training to deter a land invasion of the Amazon. And they also want to protect the so-called blue Amazon, the offshore oil fields, which are now going to be so lucrative for the country. So it isn't a totally passive, non-militarized society. It's one that has plans for weapons acquisitions, nuclear subs from the French and so on, fighter planes. But again, this is, in terms of order of magnitude, it's still, I think, much less powerful than either the Chinese or the Indian. It's under 2% of GDP, so under the spending levels that India is spending on the military.
Okay, thanks. Who in the audience might like to challenge the panel a bit on their superpower status? Yeah, please, do say who you are as well.
Yes, I'd like to say Britain don't bring the trade war aspect of the growth of the economies very much. I just bought a computer monitor on Saturday, which was excellent, brilliant reproduction. It cost £90, and I just cannot understand how China can create such a masterpiece with such small money without artificially low exchange rate. This is part of the closed economies of all these countries where we are happily importing, but we're not able to export. I mean, in India, I get orders, or I will get orders, but we're not allowed to order using their credit cards unless they happen to be the sort of the overall hotel chain in one instance, or a site of India gyms another. All the populations are stopped from ordering overseas, so it's a one-way traffic. It's a trade war taking place, which you seem to keep in the background.
A trade war before a military war. Who'd like to go? Sunil?
Could you repeat the first part of it? This £90 scenario, something I didn't get it. I didn't hear you clearly.
Yeah, that was made in China, and I'm saying it's only so cheap, taking into account it comes from the other end of the Eurasian landmass, 8,000 miles, by an artificially low exchange rate. low standards of nutrition in order to finance the vast reserves we're building up?
This is a very thank you for this question. This is a very typical sort of understanding argument about the Chinese using low, very cost labor, producing mass products and export them to the outside world at a very low sort of rate, saying that that's one of the ways of accumulating huge trade surplus. There are problems, obviously, as you have rightly observed, and it's Chinese economic development over the last several decades, to some extent, relied heavily on this sort of export. But having said that, this is an issue which Chinese government and the intellectual world have very well recognized, and they have developed measures to tackle that. That's why, for example, in 2007-08, when I go back to talk to the State Council development resistant people who are very much at the minds of adjusting Chinese economic structure, they are designing measures to deal with all these issues.
I could just say a couple of things. I mean, well, India doesn't actually have a controlled exchange rate. It's a floating rate. So it's a complicated way by which it's worked out. But it's certainly not controlled in the way that, for example, the Chinese currency is. And I think you were alluding to foreign exchange controls about whether or not Indians can buy. In fact, they're much liberalized than what they were. But it's not a completely open currency. I mean, the rupee is not a tradable currency on international currency markets. That is true. I mean, just more generally, I mean, I think, India is very clearly not pursuing a mercantilist strategy in terms of how it's directing its kind of economic project. And the clear comparison there would be, say, to take the case of Africa and to see how China and India are sort of operating in China, in Africa, and the different strategies. I mean, in India's case, it's very much private entrepreneurs on the whole who are operating in Africa. And I think there is a sense, that mercantilism or neo-mercantilist kind of strategies may be a very good way to acquire power quickly, but it's not a very good way to sustain power. Particularly given the kind of changes that I was describing earlier. So neo-mercantilism may be a good way to quickly grasp at power, but it's not a reliable way to hold on to it.
I think your question illustrates nicely one of the paradoxes of the rise of India, China, Brazil, in that much of what Sunil so eloquently said about India, I think also applied to China and Brazil, in the sense of wanting more multilateral world, wanting to challenge traditional hierarchies of power, wanting to bring up issues of global governance. And of course, they are very active diplomatically, both in multilateral global institutions, but also in the BRICS summits. But when you get down to specific issues, such as currency, exchange rates, they don't necessarily agree on this issue. And that's a good example. This currency issue is a good example where I think the Brazilians feel that they have a certain amount of legitimate grievance about the Chinese currency policies, also, for that matter, American quantitative easing, because they feel themselves somewhat squeezed. They have a floating exchange rate as well. They've prided themselves up to now on having a fairly balanced economy that has commodity exports, but also a fair amount of manufacturing, a good-sized industrial park that they feel is becoming uncompetitive, because partly, not just Chinese currency, but these other global pressures. So it now has a lot of so-called hot money coming in, because Brazil has very high interest rates. This is driving up their exchange rate. It's great for Brazilian tourists coming to London. They're coming in record numbers, but it doesn't help Brazilian manufactured exports. And they've actually brought this to the WTO and said to the WTO, we need to discuss trade in the context of currency. And currencies that are controlled by governments with the specific intention of preserving market share. And of course, Brazilian manufacturers are convinced, rightly or wrongly, that they're losing some of their own domestic market because of and also the neighboring markets in Latin America because of Chinese exports. So there's actually a seminar on this coming up in a few days in the Brazil Institute. There's an economist, Rhys Jenkins, who will actually discuss this very issue, whether Chinese exports are making inroads into Brazil and whether they are really the cause of some of the deindustrialization that we're seeing in Brazil. But this is an issue very close to Guido Mantega's heart, the finance minister of Brazil. He's talked several times to the press about currency wars and how they're unfair to Brazil.
Okay, anybody else? Yeah, please.
I have one comment and one question. The comment is about this question. I found that this question is a false question. I think this really reflects the people who are losing their powers, they want to put this kind of, rising these kind of countries into competition. So this is something which is, this is the comment. And my question is, and in my recently I met this vice premier of the China, and in discussion, he asked us a question. China is lifting this kind of, this and 1/5 of the world population from the poverty, and what kind of price we are going to pay. So I further divide this into two questions. First one is what price the Chinese have to pay for they to lead a better life. This is the first question. Of course, this had to be answered by Chinese. But second part is what price the rest of the world had to pay for the China to be lifted from the poverty into this one of these equal and members of the world community. So my question is for rest of us and for the people who ask this question, what kind of price the world are willing to pay for the China to rise? Thank you.
Anyone want to very briefly touch that?
Yeah.
Suzanne?
If I may interpret this question like as is, because China, as a late comer to the international community, where global institutions have largely been in place, and now China, being one of the faster emerging horizon powers, now find that existing institutions may not be sufficient to tackle all the issues or to meet the demands or needs by all the BRICS, all these countries. Actually, I reckon that that's a sort of frustration shared by India and Brazil to a large extent, according to a very recent global governance survey by an authority in Europe. This issue, what Professor Yang has raised, I think it's very much at the heart of about how power is being redistributed, or how maybe according to Sunny, how power is fused in a way which is unprecedented in human history. Now in IR we are talking about multipolar world, or when we talk about a non-polar world, some kind of geo sort of world, we're talking about regionalism as well. And one of the arguments about China's rise is China might just become a regional power, called a superpower, because of largely its cultural values, which are not necessarily consistent with the liberal democratic lines. And now Chinese, it's quite interesting, if I may just take this opportunity to have a few observations, very briefly. Yes, I will. If you look at the Chinese contemporary, modern history, let's say contemporary history since, let's say since mid-19th century, you will see a China which is completely trying hard to embrace the world, to open to alternative ways of organizing state, to different ways of organizing human lives, actually, or relations among people. So what I'm trying to say here is you see a China embarking on the journey of modernization, which in Chinese intellectuals' mind is by and large modernization up until, I guess, just 20 years ago, 10 years ago. Now it's time, many reckon in China and outside, that it's time for the Chinese to pause a little bit and to see what the Chinese people can contribute to the world from its own traditional philosophical thinking. And to say now it looks at the world is completely unprepared for the rise of China and the rise of other BRIC countries. So is there any ideation of source which we might be able to tap into to make a contribution to a possible peaceful world?
I'm going to actually, because we're getting really short of time, let me just take very briefly two more points here. Yes, there and then there, please. And then I'm going to then ask you perhaps each to, if I can do this in a single sentence, to sum up the argument for the case for your country as the superpower, however you want to define it. But please, yes.
I was very taken by Professor Khilnani's words about legitimacy and the power that this gives to a world, a future power worldwide. I was sorry that he didn't, in his remarks about his own country, he didn't say a little more about what I, from one who has never been to India, but see as one of the elephants in the Indian dining room, which is race and the situation with Pakistan on Kashmir. As far as China is concerned, I was sorry that I didn't see very much coming from Dr. Yang about the legitimacy of the Chinese model. Do we know what that is? Is it Marxism-Leninism of any sort left? Is it just a ghost, and a very strong ghost of Chinese nationalism? And as far as Brazil is concerned, I was sorry that he didn't make more of what I think is the very strong legitimacy that Brazil has grown under the present government and under its predecessor, which has given, I think, Brazil an enormous amount of legitimacy around the world.
Okay, thanks.
Hello, my name is Mateus. I'm from Brazil and studying at LSE. And I would like to ask something to Professor Anthony. To what extent do you think that the failure in economic integration in South America with the Mercosur puts in check or makes the position of Brazil as a superpower in doubt in South America? Thank you.
Very briefly.
Yeah, Brazil is somewhat constrained by its geography. It has as its main trading partner within Mercosur Argentina, rather than an economy that's anywhere close to its own capacity and size. And so I think it's probably already maximized its advantage. That it has seen a big growth in regional trade in the first few years of Mercosur, but that's sort of plateaued, and it's being held together, I think, mainly as a political alliance, because that axis is very important to Brazil, more than its economic value. But I think that's why the focus has shifted now to UNASUR, and talk now of South America being the region that's really important. Not completely to the detriment of Mercosur, but I think the logic of UNASUR is a continental-wide process of integration as opposed to sticking with Mercosur. So I think that's where the potential lies.
Okay, so that's fine. Sunil first, briefly, just in a sentence. Why should we be convinced that India is the next superpower?
Okay, a number of things I wanted to comment on, but
cut it down because we're.
No, I'll hold back. Well, I think. To come back to the legitimacy question, and I absolutely take the point about Kashmir, which is Kashmir and the Northeast are two very serious problems that India has to address, and these are a subject of debate. But I think there are 5 ways, I think, in which India has kind of legitimacy which are going to be important. I mentioned that it's been a critic, it's now an advocate of globalization. It's been a critic of Western values, but it also embraces many values which are recognizably Western and universal in that sense. It's a poor country which is part of the G20. It has interests on both sides. It's been one of the largest recipients of terrorism, but it hasn't sort of pinned that on a single religion. It's a democracy, but it's not an aggressive promoter of democracy. In all of those cases, it somehow bridges these different roles. And I think that gives it an extraordinarily unique position in the world, and a position that actually it can make a lot of in the years to come.
Thank you. That's a lot of semicolons. But
You want me to say
Suzanne.
Dramatically one.
So I think...
Sorry, we're really running out, but you can carry on afterwards because we're going to have some discussion there. But,
I'd love to respond to the gentleman's question maybe afterwards, because I'm asked to wrap up. So, what I want to say is China means great, enormous opportunities and challenges to not just China, but the whole world. And what I want to say is in China, the opinions and voices are ever more diverse than before. And I think China really needs to focus on domestic issues, and China needs to foster a very peaceful, constructive international environment as well. And also, I don't want to use this as my final sentence, but I think as a gentle warning, I think I will always say this so-called self-fulfilled prophecy. If you treat an enemy as an enemy, it may become an enemy.
okay, Tony?
I think I understand Jingzong's question, and my question back to him would be, well, why should China pay for unsustainable standards of living in the United States? I mean, I would twist the question around. But getting to the summation, I take Hugh's point. I mean, maybe I didn't emphasize enough the Lula and Dilma government's contribution to what my third point was at the beginning, which was that Brazil has gone a long way in addressing its social deficit, trying to manage difference, trying to promote social and economic inclusion, expanding access to education, addressing its historic inequality. And if power is partly derived from legitimacy, then I think that gives Brazil a lot of legitimacy in global fora where questions of inequality and global governance are paramount. So, and like India, Brazil has embraced and criticized globalization. So you have a very powerful anti-globalization movement at the same time that it's benefited to some extent from globalization. So I would say, for all those reasons, I think Brazil does have a lot to offer and will have a lot more to offer in coming years.
Okay, well, none of you seems entirely convinced about superpower, at least in a concept, or your ability to really make the case for your country.
Power, I think.
Power, certainly. And I don't want to hold us up any longer because hopefully there's at least one thing that's maybe not the old superpowers, but at least the old industrialized world can still offer you, which is wine. But and that's coming up straight after this. But for now, thank you very much for your contributions, and thank you all for coming.
One of the things that we didn't have time to get round to today, or tonight, but hopefully you'll have time to speak to or ask the speakers about is cultural power. I'm sure that's a major dimension. I can never quite understand how people buy such a bland, unhealthy food as McDonald's without cultural power. And we also, of course, have the universalism, as was picked out on a Radio 4 interview I heard about 6 months ago, where some young British people were being asked about British food, and the accusation was British food was terrible food, and their response was, no, it isn't, we've got great food, and the response was, give some examples, and the examples were, well, we've got Indian, we've got Chinese, we've got Italian. Now, Brazilian food wasn't mentioned, much as I like Brazilian food, but I think I'd favour for Brazil the widespread adoption of people who can make a really good caipirinha. And with food and drink on my mind, I'd like to invite you all to Chapters, which is more or less immediately above us here. So if you go out through the door, the left-hand side one, go out the left hand, yes, your left-hand side, go out and just bear slightly right, up the stairs, and then come back on yourself. You can actually go out the other way and come back on yourself as well. So go out either end, up the stairs, and along in the middle. That's where you'll find the food and drink. So I hope you've enjoyed tonight. I hope you've learned a lot. I'd like to thank the speakers and thank Andrew in particular for his work. Please join us upstairs.
I'm going to follow you. Very good.